Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are a nonprofit and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. What we do in our work is we really strive to make foreign affairs and international affairs accessible to all and really create a better informed citizenry that can contribute to conversations in their communities. So we run a number of different programs. We cover a whole host of topics, so please feel free to follow us on social media. And a lot of our conversations, such as this one, are recorded and then posted on our YouTube channel, so you can also catch up with them there. So we are very pleased to have two terrific panelists with us today to discuss a topic that I think often feels very far removed. It's pretty abstract in many ways, but it really has tremendous implications for U.S. national security. And so we will be talking about the talent pipeline for public service and national security jobs in particular. So it's a really wide-ranging topic. I hope that we can put some parameters around it while also making the best use of our panelists' knowledge. So it's my great honor to introduce our panelists today. So first we have Brett Hunt, and he comes with a background in the public sector and the private sector, and he's really committed to developing a pipeline of well-rounded and well-exposed leaders who are dedicated to public service. He is currently the Senior Director of Next Generation Service Initiatives at the Volcker Alliance. Prior to that, he was the founding executive director of the nation's first public service academy at Arizona State University. So welcome, Brett. And we are also pleased to welcome Sherry Van Sloun. She is currently an intelligence fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's on loan from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where she recently served as Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Human Capital. So both panelists come with a dedication to public service and an appreciation for the really critical role that a well-educated and well-trained cadre of public service professionals play in the functioning of any country. And so I think we'll have, be able to cover a lot of interesting facts today. And with that, I just want to say thank you both for joining us and also thank you for your service. So just to start us off, Brett, starting with you, could you get us all on the same page? How would you define the challenge that I mentioned earlier? Could you put some numbers in comparison so that the audience can really understand, what it is we're talking about and why we should care about the public service national security pipeline issue now?
Thanks so much, Courtney. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Sherry, thank you so much for sharing the Zoom here. I'm honored to get to spend some time with you as well. So, we use the term a lot today in the United States of crisis. We have crisis in all different places in our lexicon and in our world. And so I'm not going to assign the term crisis to this quite yet, but I'll let the audience determine what it is they want to call it. We'll call it a big problem. And just a little bit of context when we talk about public sector, we'll get narrowly down kind of into the national security intelligence community space, but we're talking about hiring challenges across all elements of government. That is the federal government, state government, and local government. All levels are facing similar or the same challenges of attracting and hiring the top talent to come and work in the government. If we zoom in to the federal government very specifically, between 2020 and 2025, about a third of the federal government workforce is going to retire. That means they're between the ages of 60 to 64. And so that not only is a major loss, 1/3 of your workforce is retiring and leaving. That leaves spots open that people were doing those jobs for many years. It also means that some of your most experienced folks, people with institutional knowledge, deep relationships across agencies, are leaving the federal government. So it almost takes it to a much higher level. It's about 190,000 individuals kind of leaving in the next couple of years. So that's a pretty stark situation, particularly when you look at the supply side of government hiring. Where we have, a incredibly low unemployment rate right now. So there's a lot of competition for talent out in the marketplace between the public, private, and nonprofit sector. And so at that really low unemployment rate, your supply is diminished in a way that is pretty historic given the headwinds we have around folks retiring and leaving government. And so I think that really pulls it into a place where we need to look at, why is it that folks are not choosing to work in government, pursue public sector jobs? And that really takes us kind of, I talked about the supply side of the, low unemployment rate around 3.5%. When we look at the demand side and what product is being put out there by the government, oftentimes it's not great. I'm a big fan of government, but oftentimes the hiring process is not great. Applicants complain about not having compelling job descriptions, right? When they're looking at jobs and trying to choose whether they're going to take it. Gen Z in particular is very interested in diversity, and there's oftentimes not genuine language around the value of diversity. I think we've all become accustomed to this, but in particular Gen Z, we want a positive applicant experience. We expect to have a pleasing place to go apply for a job, learn about a job, a warm handoff to a human being. We expect that in the marketplace now. And we don't see that the public sector is keeping up with the private sector in terms of providing that kind of positive user experience when an applicant is going through the process. And then the final thing I'll say is, really applicants complain about not knowing the full range of benefits that come with a government job, right? And so while your salary may be more attractive at the beginning of a job in the private sector, that's not taking into account the healthcare benefits, life insurance benefits, all of those other things that the government can provide well, that aren't necessarily apparent to applicants in the current process. So we have a major supply issue with 190,000 federal government workers leaving to retire, and then we have a demand side issue with really government agencies not competing well with the private sector.
Great. Thank you, Brett. Sherry, turning to you. Brett just outlined this big problem as he defined it. And I'd love just to hear from you, what are the national security implications of falling short on recruitment for national security and public sector jobs? When you're looking down the pipeline from your perspective, what are some of the biggest concerns and ramifications of this that you see?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. First, thanks for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I think, when folks think about the federal workforce, a lot of the everyday things we think about that we probably take for granted, having those positions filled could impact every American in so many different ways. But when you're focusing in on the national security workforce at the federal level, I think as we continue to see the complexity of the world come at us in geopolitics and technology and pandemics, all the things that are happening at the speed that we've never seen before, you think about a lack of capability in cybersecurity and offensive cyber capabilities, supply chain, protecting the supply chain, critical infrastructure. How do we work with the public sector and the private sector? How does that partnership get better to understand how we provide threat information to those critical infrastructures that we're trying to protect? I think just thinking of in those 4 or 5 broad areas, right away you can see if we don't have the talent to collect that information, to analyze that information, including language talent and technical talent, and being able to relay that in a way at the speed that our private sector needs to have, you can certainly see quickly how fast a decline could impact our everyday life that we take for granted, right? You think about critical infrastructure from the financial sector. I'm here in New York City for this fellowship, and we've talked to a lot of the different financial institutions. Protecting that alone is a huge impact on the federal workforce to be able to deliver that kind of threat information to those critical infrastructures that we take for everyday use of our banking systems. So I think I think Brett's points were really, really good on the federal government being able to attract talent, being able to engage with applicants and talk about benefits and really kind of giving insight into the critical work they'll be doing. We have ways to start thinking about filling those gaps, but I think we're probably not helping ourselves in that way. I think there's a lot more we can do in that space to really understand what the applicant population wants and needs and what we're not providing today that would help to fill those critical areas.
Thank you. And that's a great segue into my next question for you, Brett. You've spent a lot of time working with university students, so millennials, and I guess even Gen Z now. And these generations, I think, are largely known for being more attuned to the idea of public good. But it seems like this social focus isn't really translating into talent entering into the public sector in greater numbers. So you started to touch on some of those hurdles, but what are some of the hurdles that you're seeing? What is your just taking the pulse of this generation, like what is it that they're really interested in, and then how would you recommend overcoming some of those hurdles?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because we do see that this generation, more so than previous generations, they know more about the world. They are more connected to each other and to problems in not only their own community but problems around the world, because of the fact that they're native, to this digital landscape that we all live in now. And so they care deeply about things going on in their community and around the world. They want to serve the public good. They want to make things better. But where that comes to an abrupt halt is they don't necessarily see government work as a place to go do that. Right? They don't necessarily see that as, okay, if I want to help people, I go work for the government. They don't necessarily see that. And so, one survey says that we have access to says that 25% of Gen Z respondents say that they trust the government. 25%. That means 75% don't trust the government. That's a serious issue if you're trying to get somebody to come work for you. Now, there's been a lot of great writing recently as we've memorialized the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, which I was part of in the desert back in 2003. And so I've done a lot of the reading, and it kind of talks about, the intelligence community's failures at that time and how that did contribute to some distrust going forward. And it kind of, even though we don't think about it every day, has become part of this lack of trust in government. And so we have to, one, find a way for those folks to trust government more, but that's a serious headwind, and I have some ideas there that I'll get back to. But let's match that with another survey from Tufts that talked about 65% of respondents in that survey in Gen Z, they think and talk to each other about politics, elections, and other civic elements. Right? So they're engaged on these issues. How do we bridge the gap between their lack of trust in government and their desire to serve, and obviously they're engaged in civic elements of their lives, with choosing a career in public service? One of the ways that we're really doing it in the work that I do at the Volcker Alliance is really focused on getting upstream of this problem by engaging undergraduates in leadership development and public service values. So our goal with the Next Generation Service Corps is to inspire and prepare the next generation of leaders to serve their communities and the country. And so we do that through programs that are much like ROTC, but are focused on civilian skills for civilian public service. And so how do we identify as an 18, 19-year-old that person who wants to serve, and help them take a college degree in whatever discipline they choose and match that to skills that are important to public service, like working collaboratively, critical thinking, complex reasoning, strong communication, both orally and in written form. How do we take those students and develop them through, again, that's what we're trying to spur with the Next Generation Service Corps, through an undergraduate experience that prepares them to go and be the leaders we need in all levels of government.
Okay, great. Thanks. And actually, just one follow up there. In terms of the students that you have seen come to these programs, what was the interest level like? And were you, how did you overcome any hurdles and in that trust that you had mentioned?
So that's a great question. We really approach students from the lens of who do you want to help and what do you want to serve, right? We don't approach them and say, hey, who wants a job in government, right? That's not a very compelling thing to an 18-year-old. But we say, what's your life experience? How does that lead you to want to serve? Okay, well, I grew up in a military family, so I understand the importance of the military. I grew up in a community that was underserved, and so our faith community was very involved in helping folks, get a leg up. So I want to serve. Great. Let's bring you into this program. Let's develop you. You're going to study engineering. You're going to study business. You're going to study history. You're going to study math. We are agnostic to that. We want you to study all those things. And we want to then inspire you to serve the public. And then we want to prepare you with the tangible skills necessary to be an effective public servant. So that's really how we approach the conversation. We don't say, do you want to be a public servant? We say, what are you passionate about? How are you going to serve that community? Okay, let's get started.
Thank you. Sherry, kind of sticking with the university level conversation, you've done some really interesting writing, and I'd love for you just to talk to us about what you see happening at the university level in terms of education that's impacting the pipeline for national security and future leadership talent.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so when I first got to CFR, I wrote a blog post about just, I think over the last few decades, there's been this national call of action, I guess, for STEM talent, right? And which is absolutely right. We need more technical talent. We need folks engaged in technical work at the university level. But I think what's happened over time is we've lost the ability to think about civics and humanities intertwined with those technical degrees that we're pushing for. And so we've seen a lot of that curriculum dying off over the last couple of decades, to create this space where a student could come out of a 4-year degree program with a little bit more well-rounded aspect of the world, where they've got a technical degree in engineering, or you name it, mathematics, but they also are a well-rounded citizen, thinking about the broader implications of the technology they're studying, or the kinds of work that they're going to do in the private or public sector. And I think some of the way that these curriculums are built at the university level today don't allow students to kind of veer off really easily out of a really technical track they're in. So I think there's some looking there at how we can maybe think about the way we build our programs. And I think what it does in the end is these students, we've seen, and I'm glad to hear the Tufts survey is 65% of folks are engaged in those conversations, because I think at a lot of different places in the country where students are striving for that STEM degree, they're striving for a salary of over $100,000 when they graduate. There's things that are driving those kinds of degree programs, but I think there's a lack of context around how that's going to be used in the real world when they get out to actually do that kind of work. So I think there's it's a push-pull, right? We need more technical talent, of course. We're moving into a world where that's not going to be something we cannot have, but we also need to have these well-rounded students who can understand why they're actually going to be looking at cybersecurity from a defensive or offensive position, and what it means to geopolitics in the particular place they're looking at, how to defend cyber attacks from happening. So I think there's just some more global context around some of these fields that we're pushing on for STEM and really technical areas, that we have to reconsider the ability for these kids and these young students to really broaden their aperture and to come out with the critical thinking skills you mentioned, Brett, with the communication skills. Because as we think about, chat GPT, right? GPT, some of those code writing skills are going to go away. We're not going to need those at some point, because AI and other technologies will do that for us. It's how we use those technologies and what the secondary and tertiary effects of those technologies are going to mean in the national security space.
Yeah.
Just one as a follow-up to that, and just great piece, Sherry, and really one of the things that we've done in the design of the Next Generation Service Corps, as I said, by design, interdisciplinary, is really try to balance those engineering students with these elements that help them develop into a leader. So we say so much to our engineering students. It doesn't matter if you are the best engineering student at the university, if you can't communicate it effectively to an audience, you're not as effective as you could possibly be. And so for example, the oldest program, the program I founded at Arizona State University, it's been around since 2015. Our top two in terms of numbers of students are coming out of the business college and the engineering college. And so that's the largest number of students that are in these programs. And many of those students actually see it as a way to balance this desire for the six-figure job when they're 22 years old and the stability that comes with a career that pays them well, with a desire to serve. And so I think they often see being part of the next generation service corps as a way to balance those two things. And our goal would be to convert some of those folks to folks that are going to go work in government and apply their engineering skills or their marketing skills or their linguistic skills to a government role.
I'd love to have one more follow-up. In keeping on this conversation about lopsided fields of study, perhaps. Yesterday, I think it's the national assessment. I forget what the exact acronym is. That the NAEP came out showing that scores in civics and history, I believe, among students in the United States have dropped rather dramatically. I'd love to just get your reactions to that in terms of how you see that feeding into the pipeline. Sherry, yeah.
So I think, there was a quote, civics starts at home, right? When your kids are young, you talk up to your kids about how they can help others and serve others, but it's also curriculum at the K-6. It's curriculum in the middle schools, and we are lacking in those areas across the board. And so until we really start to, I think, kind of shift the education system to start talking about those things and making them requirements before you can move on into high school and out of high school, there's got to be some emphasis from the educational system to start driving that at a much earlier age. I think I don't think you can just start in the junior year of high school and say you have to have a half a year to start changing that equation you just mentioned. I think it's much earlier than that, and it's much more intentional than that.
I would agree, and I'll just add to that. Well, I would emphatically agree. Perfect point. I can't add anything to that. But one thing I would add is, oftentimes the problems that I see on the ground at universities around the country is we can't get out of our own way in terms of people who desperately believe in this, but have a different approach to getting there. And so I think this, if you can bring together, I'm going to throw a term that's not a term, but like a traditional civics minded, faculty member together with somebody who's a little more focused on like enhanced civics. Sometimes some call it, applied civics, right? If we could have a bridging of that somehow and say, hey, we both believe in this, let's find a way to compromise on what this should look like or try some different things, that would be great. Oftentimes that can be an impediment, is just the two sides of the civics question or movement really saying, well, mine is the best, no, mine is the best. I think we need to find some space to actually move things forward, because every day we don't move this forward, we're losing ground.
I agree.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, Sherry, how does the ability for the public sector to innovate play into the ability to recruit talent to the national security workforce?
Yeah, this is a hot topic and an age-old topic, I think, for the public vice the private sector recruitment efforts. I think, before COVID, I think the federal government was already really kind of moving in this space to understand how we could do this better. We've got to be more attractive. But COVID certainly helped us think through this much faster, right? We know that some of the most critical things folks are looking for when they're looking for a job is really they want compensation, which for federal workforce or public-private, there's always going to be a discrepancy in compensation, but they want meaningful work and they want workplace flexibility. And for the national security workforce, sometimes that flexibility is really hard, right? We work in SCIFs, we work in places where you can't take your phone in every day. We work in places where you can't telework easily or remote work. And so we really have been spinning our wheels on trying to think about how we can be more innovative in those areas. We've created new STEM compensation salaries, right? We're thinking beyond that, but there's only so much we can do. And we're probably never going to get to meet the private sector salaries coming out of school or even mid-career hires. It's really difficult. But we do have a couple of really great programs active now and more in the works on how we think about compensating differently. Meaningful work, I think that's one of our core areas where for the intelligence community especially, I think, and I'm just biased there, but the work we do and how it lends to the national security apparatus and the interesting work that, at the end of the day, something that you're doing is contributing to something larger. And it's giving information to folks who are making our most critical decisions on policy, the most insights we can on those geopolitics and the things that are happening around the globe. But we have been working closely with private sector, right? And I think this is one of the areas where the government, federal workforce can really kind of lean forward and thinking about ways to bridge public and private in a way where folks can understand they can come in and work for the federal government, work for the national security workforce, but also have potential to reach out and do some time in the private sector and come back in and move more seamlessly between the two, where there's not just, it's so disparate sometimes on you either work for one or the other. How do we make that more of a seamless idea where it's, you can work on both sides and contribute to national security in much of the same way? I know for the intelligence community, we had an effort ongoing, we still do, it's called the Right Trusted Agile Workforce. And one of those areas where we pushed for new legislation was for private public talent exchange, where we were able to send our folks into private sector for a while and have private sector folks come in and look at government problems for a while and help us kind of think through new ways of doing it, how to tackle hard problems that maybe we didn't have the right skill sets for, or that's something that the private side is way advanced from the public in certain areas. So help us think about how do we catch up? How do we get there? So there's been a lot of thinking through how do we be more competitive? How do we think about being innovative when we're talking to applicants about working for the intelligence community or the national security workforce? But it's still hard, right? I think folks are a little bit, maybe it's misunderstood sometimes about who we are. I know we talk to a lot of applicants, they think that everyone in the federal government is a political appointee, and that is not the case. And so a lot of times there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding about, we are nonpartisan, we support any president in the White House, we are civil servants. And the work we do is critical to not have that piece of it, the political piece of it at all in the work that we do every day. And so I think sometimes it's educational. We've done a lot of work on reaching out to an applicant pool across the country in new ways, looking at hotspots of the country that we don't target traditionally, and we should be. Trying to do more virtual outreach, trying to, do more ways of thinking about the intelligence community as one community and not 18 different agencies who folks get completely overwhelmed with understanding what those 18 different places do and how they contribute to the whole. I think we've done a lot of work in that space to really brand ourselves in new ways, but it's still difficult. I think when folks think about, public versus private, there's some enticing things about being in the private sector. But I think one of the areas that we really have to push on, like I said, is bridging the gap between the two and not making it one or the other.
Thank you. I was curious about that and was going to ask. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Brett, shifting to another side of the national security equation, the military. You had experience in the military. I think you both probably did. What do you see in trends in military recruitment, and does that, how does that impact the broader picture of the national security pipeline?
Yeah, it's not good. So, if you look at just the applicant pool, this is not propensity to serve, just the applicant pool of 17 to 24-year-olds in the United States, only somewhere between 20 and 24% of that population is eligible to serve. And that's due to issues related to obesity, issues related to depression or anxiety, other things that can be disqualifying for security clearances, legal issues, drug use issues. So that's the pool you start with before you ever try to recruit that person in. You're at 20 to 24%. So there's just news this week, the Army's going to miss its goal again. So the Army, had put a lot of money, a lot of effort behind, increasing their numbers, and they're going to miss it again for another year. And so it's a really difficult scenario. And again, I just think that the military has done a better job, because they've been doing it a lot longer than I think other government agencies, at getting upstream of this, right? So So quite likely that if you are, physically fit and doing well in school, that you're probably going to have a recruiter talk to you sometime between your freshman and junior year of high school, and potentially put you on a track to either become an officer or enlist after graduation. But they need to be doing a better job of getting to those folks. And even, one of the intractable issues with military recruitment that I think is probably shared by the intelligence community, but I won't speak for Sherry, are lack of innovation in what is qualifying and disqualifying for security clearances and for service, that are very common for this current population of 17 to 24-year-olds. For example, use of ADHD, ADD medications at certain parts of their life, use of different antipsychotics that may be now readily diagnosed and prescribed for folks with anxiety or other types of things that are then disqualifying for the military. So, if we miss a 17-year-old with a propensity to serve because they were on ADHD medication within the last 36 months, that person's probably going to move on to another career and choose not to go serve in the military. So I think that's one of the difficulties that faces the military.
Terrific, thank you. And switching gears once again before I get to the Q&A box. And again, if you're listening and have any questions at any point, please put them in the Q&A box and I will get to them soon. So Sherry, another area of national security that we haven't yet talked about is the development and production of goods that are key to national security. So could you please talk about the CHIPS Act that was passed last year and how the talent pipeline plays into the ability to execute on that act?
Yes, I would love to. This is a really interesting area for me. I've been looking into recently. As you all know, the CHIPS Act put over $50 billion into the semiconductor research, development, manufacturing, and workforce development. And I think there's a lot of discussion going on around, building fabs and building the capability, but there's not a lot of discussion maybe more broadly on how we're looking at building that talent pipeline. And so if you think from the intelligence community and the national security workforce, these things are really important to us and the way we build systems and to collect and analyze. So they're really critical to us as well. But to build that talent pipeline takes a lot of work on the academic side of the house, right? And so I've met with several folks from the National Science Foundation who are managing grants, NIST. I've talked to the Intel Corporation on how they're thinking about talent. And I really, it's really fascinating to see the grant process is already up and running. There's already a call for grants. So this thing is moving. It's not one of those pieces of legislation that kind of sits on the table and collects dust. There's a lot of activity in this space. But it seems to me that we've got, I think a lot of academic activity in the states where there are already fabs built, right? And these fabs are very, very expensive to build. And so you can imagine that they're building kind of talent around those areas where they have those fabs, right? So Ohio, Arizona, Texas, those are some of the really big states that are going to be leveraging some of these funds to build curriculum, to produce more students to work in these kinds of facilities. I would say too, though, after speaking with several companies, there's more to this population of workforce that is that high-tech talent. So not all of the talent at Intel or you name it, any other company that's doing this kind of work is PhD level talent. There's a gap there. There's a huge gap in that space where U.S. talent pipeline doesn't produce enough talent there today. And there's a lot of discussion going on about immigration policy and how immigration changes could help fill that gap that we have at that really top end PhD talent that's driving the leading edge chip development that we want to get ourselves into. But for the other parts of the packaging and manufacturing and testing, there's other talent needed, and it's not just PhD level. It's a 2-year degree, it's 4-year degree. Even high school talent is being looked at for some of those jobs. And so I think that discussion and that broader discussion for the US, kind of entire workforce, not just those states where we think talent's critical, we've got to start having that conversation so that there's kind of a national call to action for this kind of work. If the US wants to be a leader in this industry, as we do, we've really got to start getting the word out about how young kids can get involved in this kind of work. And I think there are universities who are doing this very well now. Brett, you probably know ASU and University of Arizona are both heavily involved in building curriculum to build this kind of talent. The Ohio State University is actively engaged in this process as well. They've got a consortium, I think, of 36 schools in Ohio that are involved with the Ohio State University. Many of those are two-year degree schools, kind of talking to kids and building curriculum about how we're needing this talent pipeline to help the US be a leader in the semiconductor business, and especially not just in the trailing edge, which other countries are actively engaged into. I think China is building the most facilities now for the leading edge chip development, but it's that, I'm sorry, the trailing edge, it's that leading edge, the next generation of chips is where we really want to be a leader in that industry.
That's great. And that's actually a great segue to one of the questions that I see in the Q&A box, which is about recruitment and how in the questioner writes, in the past, it was in colleges. Is anyone thinking about recruitment in trade schools? And I think you mentioned a little bit of this, but, would you mind expanding, both of you, are you seeing opportunities that go beyond, say, a four-year college to look for recruitment?
Brett, would you like to go first?
Sorry.
I can chime in a little bit here. One of the things that we're focused on with our work are transfer students, and so these are oftentimes students that are moving into roles, right out of high school, have life experience, and then are coming back to the university to add a degree, right? Maybe two more years of a degree. And I think that's a really important space that both the government and key national security private sector interests like CHIPS should be looking at, because that is a population of student that is coming to attain education when they need it for their next step, right? They're not doing it in an anticipation of something, right? They're doing it because to move to the next level, I need to be able to do this. And I think just being nimble enough as universities, I think that's going to be a key element to that. And then I will chime in on the Arizona side. I sit here at Arizona State University. It's where I'm at today in my office. And I can tell you, it's been really interesting to see not only the engineering college getting, completely embedded in this work and a full effort by the university and Dr. Crow here at ASU at doing it, but the way that it's translating across all other disciplines. So I'm in the School of Public Affairs as a professor of practice, and I have students that are working on issues related to machine learning and public policy as it relates to chip development, right? That's this fascinating wrinkle that, oh, by the way, Sherry probably has an intelligence community need at some point in terms of analysis. And so those are the types of young people who are 18, 19, 20, 22 years old, who, I think will be well positioned to move into one position, maybe with the city of Phoenix, and then go work in the private sector for manufacture, and then maybe an excellent candidate for a federal role in the intelligence community analyzing those issues.
That's really encouraging, Brett. That's great. Yeah, so I think from the Intel community perspective or national security workforce, we are actually looking further into, we used to be very, very four-year degree focused. And there's a lot of areas of work that we have gaps in that we know that could be done with a two-year degree. And I think there's a lot more recruitment efforts at some of the associate degree schools. We're really targeting those. Also talking to kids who may just have certificate programs, right? I mean, there's some incredible coding and IT talent that maybe not even have their two-year degree. And so at some point, do you have to think about whether that's even needed or not, or are certificate-based programs enough to actually fill some of those critical gaps where kids aren't going to go back to school yet, maybe, or you get them in and you promise, look, if I had my way, I would be targeting two-year schools to say, do your 2 years, come in to work for the federal government, we'll pay for your next 2 years and get you your 4-year degree. There's so many ways we could think about leveraging talent that may not be thinking yet about a national security role. But I think we have certainly overcome the idea that every applicant must have a 4-year degree, especially in some of those critical gap areas where we know that 4-year degree isn't going to make it or break it on their ability to conduct the work that we need done. So I think there's a lot of movement there. And I would say that from the Intel side, from the Department of Defense side, that's being looked at very closely, and we're changing the way we're thinking about recruitment in those schools.
And just an addition to that, one, Sherry, we should partner on Next Generation Service Corps, have those 2-year students come into the Next Generation Service Corps and then be ready to go work for you. A place where there's a lot of really interesting innovation around this are actually community colleges adjacent to military installations. Because those military installations quite often have a very specific need. So I'm thinking where I was stationed at Fort Huachuca in Southern Arizona, the Intel Center, and the Cochise Community College has very specific programs with the University of Arizona for needs of that installation. And so they've built these very technical 2-year degrees, right, that you walk straight out and go to a job, at Fort Huachuca. And so I think there's a model there, right? And if we could somehow find a way to innovate on that model at a larger scale, I think you get, to a place where you could be attracting that talent, because by and large, the transfer student, or whatever you want to term that population, it's termed different in different states, but the transfer population, they have more life experience than your 18 to 22-year-old. They are more diverse than your 18 to 22-year-old at a 4-year university. And they come in with a whole other set of skills that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And so we should be embracing that population, running straight at that population, and really allowing them to find meaning and economic impact by transitioning to their 4-year degree and then going on to a great career.
Fantastic. Another really interesting question about recruitment, and the questioner wants to ask about the Top Gun phenomenon that happens to Navy recruitment every time Tom Cruise films a movie, is what the questioner writes. But I think I could probably attest, as someone who following Carrie Russell's career trajectory from her attendance at University of New York, which was I went to NYU, and I think applications just bounced immediately following the release of her show. And of course, now there's The Diplomat. Do you see a role for Hollywood? Is there a way that Hollywood can tell the stories of what it's like to be someone in the public sector, national security, in a way that helps boost recruitment? Sherry, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, so I think Hollywood has helped us in many ways. I mean, if you think about any of the movies that talk about the work of the intelligence community, some are far-fetched and some aren't very accurate. In fact, most of them aren't. But we do certainly see, rises in applications based on certain things that are happening in Hollywood. And we have relied on Hollywood to help us think about recruitment videos. And we just actually published our first, I think, streaming recruitment ad on Hulu or Netflix, one of the streaming ads. So we are trying to leverage those capabilities. Of course, I think that's sometimes getting it right is hard. You can't tell them everything, but you can tell them enough for them to be dangerous. So it certainly does help. And I think, I would just say intelligence work is changing too every day, right? In the past, it was like the human interaction, the spies that really kind of got attention. But with technology and changing the way intelligence is being done and thinking about open source intelligence, that does change the idea and the flavor and the context around intelligence work. So yes, I think Hollywood can be a big help. Sometimes they've gotten it really wrong, but they can certainly help us think through it and reach such a broad audience of potential applicants for the work that we do.
I can just confirm that the Top Gun phenomenon is real, and even in my own Army home, where my son is like, "Wow, that looks really cool." I'm like, "It's not that cool. What's really cool is the Army." But yes, no, I think it is real. I would actually, I do think Hollywood, and I think Sherry covered all that really, really well, the role they have to play. I would actually seek out the opposite end of the spectrum and engage high school and college students in designing recruiting. And so this is something that we've done through something called Level Up Gov, a contest we just ran at the Volcker Alliance, where we engaged college students and maybe senior high school students in designing and producing recruiting ads for the federal government. And so you can check it out, levelup.gov. You can go see the applicants and the winners. But I would actually go in that direction, right? And so So these students, these young people, they have strong opinions about these things because, again, they were raised in an environment that is native to YouTube and to social media, and transitioning from one social media platform to another because it's more pleasing in some way. And so I would actually advocate for engaging them in the process. And what is it that you want to see? What would convince you to choose to take a chance on a career in the intelligence community? I think that's a great tactic. And I know some are doing. This is nothing new that I'm coming up with, but that's kind of, I think would be an interesting population to query on this.
Hey, Brett, that's a great idea. And I just chime real quick. We just released this video and I put it in front of some of the junior staff at the Council on Foreign Relations. So some of the research associates and the interns. And I said, hey guys, this is our newest video. What do you think?
Yeah.
And it was, you missed the mark. Already, we just spent a ton of money on. We thought
Right.
this was a really cool video. We're going to hit the right, demographics across the country. We missed the mark. So you're spot on.
We did something similar a couple of years ago, and we were talking about how to engage our students in the Next Generation Service Corps with military and veterans as a way of acquainting them with people who serve and why they serve and those types of things. So I had a panel idea and all this kind of stuff, but then put it in front of students, and they're like, "Well, I just want to talk one-on-one to a veteran, and why did you choose? What was it like?" Those types of things. So we ended up doing, remember, Humans of New York. We did like a Humans of military veterans, and it was a room full of military veterans, and every 5 minutes a bell rang and you moved to the next veteran and you just talked, right? And so that was, I would have never come up with that. I would have had a panel with refreshments. But
I love that.
Such great points. We have a question here from someone who writes that their daughter is a senior in college and interested in national security. And the daughter was telling her that one of the issues is that it takes such a long time to get a security clearance, and that by the time graduates finally get it, they have other job offers or have started a job already. Do you think this is a valid point? Sherry, I saw you came off mic, so I think why don't you jump right in?
Target it right at me, I'm sure. No, it's a great question, and we get asked a lot. And I'm very happy to say that Director Haynes, the current DNI, she has put an intentional focus on this issue, especially to get us much shorter time frame, 180 days or less. We're really focusing on getting folks into the pipeline from the time they apply to in a seat within 6 months. And I know that's a big goal, going down from where we probably were in the past at 2 years. But it's definitely an issue for us, and we're losing talent every day if we don't get this right. And so it's a fine balance, right? To be able to vet folks in the right way to make sure we're getting folks in the door that understand their responsibilities and who are responsible enough to maintain that clearance, but also doing it in a way that doesn't allow us to lose talent. And so I think for a lot of the younger population that we're recruiting through internships, we do a ton of internships. And the idea there is that you get somebody in the internship process during their junior, maybe even their sophomore year, and they get their clearance long before they are ever going to graduate. And they're actually being offered jobs. The conversion rate of our interns to full-time employees is like somewhere in the 73% range. So internships, turn over into full-time jobs, and you are cleared and ready to roll before you graduate college. And so that's really an area that we're focusing on. And even if you're not doing an internship, is there a way to start offering jobs by the time you're a junior in college so that the clearance process can happen while you're still in school? And then by the time you graduate or close to it after that, you're ready to come on into the federal government with the clearance active. And so there's a lot of intentional areas that we're focusing on to fix that. And I know it's a lot to ask of any person to offer up all of that information, asking us to protect it. And I think that's probably some areas of where folks have some concern too, but you're giving up a lot of your, details of your life and where you've been, where you've traveled to, your family. And we have to protect that data and process it in a way quickly to get folks in the door, because we certainly do lose talent to folks who say, I can't wait that long. I need a job. I have, things I have to do, and I have obligations I have. So we understand that that's an issue for us, and we are laser focused on that. And like I said, Director Haynes has been phenomenal leader in this space of really getting on it and investing in technology and more people to process to get folks in the door faster.
And I just think, Director Haynes is exactly the leader we need at this moment in this space. the private sector has a 70 to 90% conversion rate from paid internships to jobs, right? So for folks choosing, so similar to what Sherry was saying on the intelligence community. And so the earlier, again, if we can get upstream of these students and we're acquainting them with these career opportunities as freshmen and sophomore, and then we're putting them into paid internships each summer, then they are poised to go and be able to do this work. You know, if we look at ROTC and the academies for preparing military officers, you begin the clearance process your sophomore year of college, right? And so one, that means that you can maybe do some really cool internships your junior or senior year if it's fast. If you are a military brat and you've traveled around the world for your whole life, it might be a little bit longer. But really, then you're ready the day you graduate to go to work. So anyway, just reiterating everything Sherry said, but that if I had a magic wand and they said, hey, here's a pot of money, and we're gonna do one thing to try to solve for this problem, it would be paid internships for students upstream of the time that they're going to graduate from four-year degree.
Yeah, and actually we have a lot of focus right now on high school co-op programs where we're paid. You're starting as a high school student, so you start getting folks in early before they go to college and veer off into a different or do something that wouldn't allow them to be part of the national security apparatus when they graduate. So yeah, we're really focusing on high school programs as well. Several of the IC agencies have high school programs, but we're trying to broaden that to get more high school students involved early. Yeah.
That's great. We've talked a lot recently about some of the processes about getting people in the door. But we have a really interesting question for you, Brett. And could you elaborate on how you work to build trust in the government among younger generations? So going back to your earlier point about the lack of trust, how do you work to build that up so that the government does become a viable option?
Oh, great question with a difficult answer. So again, we bring folks in and we don't talk about, government and working in the public sector. We bring them around passion. And then what we really try to do throughout their time in the program is we expose them to all sectors, public, private, nonprofit, and in some places we add kind of the military as a sector, even though it's not recognized that way. So one, they're learning about the tangible aspects of it. What are the values of the public sector? Well, it's transparency, it's responsibility, right? It's integrity. What are the motivations of somebody in the private sector? Well, it's serving something larger than yourself. It's getting to work on really big, complex things. And then we expose them to public service leaders. So that is either through instructors in programs, through speaker series, through internships, and all of those things are meant to rebuild their trust in government and their ability to see themselves as part of that. So that's what we're trying to do in that space. Now, the long game, in my opinion, would be we need to develop the best and brightest and have them choose public service. That means that I believe government will work better for the population, and that will instill trust, right? And so it's a long game, right? But if we have our best and brightest going into government, I believe that we will then have trust in government because government will work better for people.
If I could just add one point to Brett's comments, I think they're absolutely right. For the intelligence community, I think there has been an intentional effort, again, by DNI Haynes, to really be transparent about our mission, what we do, why we do it. Obviously, not all the details can be shared publicly, but there's been a push for more transparency into the work we do. I think you're seeing more of it being talked about in open source spaces. You're seeing more intelligence community and government leadership talking about the kind of work that we do. And I think the more you can talk about that with folks and share information. I mean, you saw the use of intelligence at the breakout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which we've never seen before. That was kind of a game changer. And then the way we think about sharing intelligence at the level we can to the public. So I think there's been a real push for to build trust, right, with the public, to share as much as we can about the work we do and why we do it and why it's so important. And I think, a decade ago, that wasn't being done in the same way it's being done today. And I think that's obviously not going to hit every person, but I think it is a targeted effort to really start to build that trust in ways we haven't before. So I'm pretty proud of that, actually.
Great point. And you brought up the war in Ukraine, and we have a question here from someone who asked, given the war in Ukraine and the rise of China, in your own analysis, and I'll direct this to you, Sherry, what kind of talent will be needed for national security in the future? I mean, we've talked a lot about STEM, we've talked a lot about other capabilities, but what do you see as being most needed given some of the geopolitical risks that are ongoing?
Yeah, if you think about, I personally, I think about cyber. I mean, cyber is going to be the way wars are fought in the future, I believe, especially for, countries like China and Russia who do have quite the cyber talent and cyber capabilities. But we also need folks who can, like I said earlier, tell the story, communicate, being able to talk to policymakers, to talk to senior leaders, to explain the geopolitics and the implications of those. I think that's sometimes lost in translation about that kind of core talent that we need in the intelligence community. We need language talent. The language AI capabilities aren't there yet. We still need that high-end language capability to help us really understand the cultural aspects of the intelligence that we're gleaning. That's a critical piece to the work we do, and there's always a gap there in our language capability. And of course, technology is there. We think about just being able to analyze and build systems to actually do the work, to collect the work, that we do. If you think about building satellites, building any kind of technical collection platforms, building software to do analysis and to do it in a way that where analysts trust what's coming out of that kind of technology. Those are all ways of the future we're thinking about, where a lot of the work that analysts do today manually will be done. The first few phases will be done by technology, and AI is going to play a major part of that. So I think the core skills of an analyst, really understanding what we're packaging and putting together and the insights we're gleaning and communicating that to our policymakers, is always going to be a piece of what we need. But I also think that the way we think about cyber and the way we think about quickly turning information and capabilities into action is going to be a critical way we think about the future.
And as a follow-up to that, Brett, is that what you're seeing in terms of interests of students coming through the programs that you've been working on, or is there a mismatch?
No, they have a very micro interest, right? That makes sense, right? So when you say you can work on this very specific cyber problem, that really motivates students. And so I think the more that can be communicated or can be practiced through cyber challenges or hackathons or, those types of things where students get to go really deep on one thing. There's just a great desire to be able to do that among these students. And again, they come up with novel ideas and things that are really compelling to glean. So yes, I would say that. But I will pull it back to, the baseline to make all of this capable, I do believe is, a solid civics foundation. And then the tangible skills necessary to be effective as a public service leader. And so that was one of the things that's, at the Volcker Alliance that Mr. Volcker was very, very focused on, was that, the idea of public finance, which was obviously where he was very deep. It's not an intent. It's not a, hey, I feel good when I serve. It is a very specific skill. And so we need to be training them in those very specific skills. So they not only need this basis in civics and good communication skills, critical thinking, all of those types of things, but then they need to have the specific skills. And so again, what we're trying to do with our work is match your engineering degree, your computer science degree, with those public service skills, in the hope that then that's the person who's ready to go be part of our work. I'm trying to understand China. So that, yes, there's a great desire for that.
Thank you both. This was a fascinating discussion, a little bit terrifying, also hopeful, a combination of both. So thank you both for the work you do. It's clearly a problem that we should all be keeping our eyes on. Just before we close, just a few notes for those who are listening. We have a couple of events next week. Next Tuesday at noon, we have the 5th in our series, our deep dive on China, where we will be looking at China's surveillance state and its global implications. So it should be a really fascinating discussion. This is open to everyone. So if you're interested, please RSVP. You can also share it with others. And then that evening, actually, we're doing a partnership with the Roosevelt House Institute of Public Policy at Hunter College, and we'll be screening a film about Ghost Mountain, the second killing fields of Cambodia, and then having a panel discussion after about the human rights of refugees. So if you're in New York, you can attend in person. If you are not in New York, you can also RSVP, get a link to the film, and then watch the discussion via Zoom. So those are a couple upcoming events. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. And again, if you're watching, we're a nonprofit. If you can, we encourage people to donate to support our work. That's how we keep these briefings free and open to all. So with that, thank you, Brett. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you everyone for listening. Take care.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.